Do you know who said this quote? I believe there is no country in the world, including the African regions, including any and all countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba. Hang on a second. Space. While you're thinking about who said that, let me tell you about a revolution that I never learned about in school. It's something that nobody ever teaches us about in schools in the United States. What you probably already know is that during Columbus's 1492 voyage, he stumbled upon several different Caribbean islands, Cuba being one of them, and that it became a Spanish colony, and at one point in time it was the biggest sugar producer in the entire world. What you probably don't know is that it only became such a large producer of sugar because of the Haitian Revolution. Many of the plantation owners from Haiti fled to Cuba so they could continue the practice over there. Spain outlawed slavery in 1811, but Cuba rejected that ban and continued the practice until 1886, a full 21 years after the United States. Technically, the United States has not abolished slavery, which made it the second to last country of the New World to abolish the practice, barely eking out Brazil, who abolished it in 1888. There were many uprisings and attempts to liberate themselves from their colonizer, and they were met with outright brutality. The term concentration camp gets its origins from Cuba, when one of their governors put the rural citizens into what he called reconcentrados, because he couldn't distinguish enemy combatant from citizen, which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Now, the United States, which had wanted Cuba for decades and even offered to purchase it from Spain, took advantage of all the civil unrest by buying up large swaths of land on the cheap. During one of those uprisings in 1898, the United States sent a battleship called the USS Maine to help protect the United States' interest on the island. The ship mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor, and the Spanish were blamed, which led to the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The war ends in 1902. Spain cedes Guam and Puerto Rico. They sell the Philippines for $20 million. The Philippines did not want a new colonizer, so they immediately began fighting the United States in another war. Cuba became a protectorate. The United States wrote the ability to intervene into their constitution and then gave them their independence. It's worth noting that none of the people that kicked the whole thing off by fighting against their colonizer were involved in any of the treaty signing. It was very much one colonizer giving something they colonized to another colonizer. The United States would continue to intervene in their affairs up until a dictator began to arise. Now, some of you might be thinking, that doesn't look anything like Fidel Castro, and you're right. This dictator's name is Fulgencio Batista. Let me read you some more of that quote I started the video with. To some extent, it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Batista is an interesting historical figure. He's a child of farmers. He grew up very poor in a shanty town. He has Spanish, African, and Chinese ancestry. He later joined the army, became a stenographer, rose through the ranks, and eventually became Cuba's only non-white president. When he became president in 1940, he also had a pretty progressive regime. They changed the constitution, and he added in provisions for things like minimum wage, healthcare, and education. He was even supported by the Democratic Socialist Party of Cuba. Per the constitution, which he himself helped write, which forbade consecutive terms, he left office in 1944 and moved to Florida. He then came back in 1952, and when it was clear that he was not going to win another term as president, he did a coup and became the worst dictator the island has ever seen. By the way, that was his second coup. I skipped over the first one because it's not as important for this video. In 2016, Bacardi, which bought the Havana Club recipe and trademark from Cuban exiles, began running an ad campaign called the Golden Age, which NBC called eye-catching advertising, which conjured up the period in Cuba before the 1959 revolution. The second coming of Batista did not usher in a new wave of progressive policies. He more closely aligned himself with wealthy Cubans, American businesses, and the American mafia, allowing the former to lucrative business contracts, land deals, and monopolies in exchange for bribes and kickbacks, and the latter the ability to deal in gambling, drugs, and prostitution in exchange for bribes and kickbacks. While it was an adult playground for American tourists with the correct skin tone, it was also a police state. During his 7-year run as a dictator, he would rack up a death toll of over 20,000 politically inspired murders. The microphone that this woman is holding in the advertisement is the only thing that would have allowed her entry into one of those clubs so that she could be a performer, same as the band in the background of this picture here. And the funny thing is, Batista was also a victim of racism himself, because even though he was one of the richest, most powerful men in the country, he was still denied membership to the Havana Yacht Club because of his skin skin color. Different location because my roommate started making a massive amount of noise. A third of the country lived in abject poverty. There was rampant unemployment amongst young people. There was massive income inequality, especially in rural areas where 400,000 people didn't have proper sanitation. Another 2.8 million didn't have electricity. They would export sugar to import candy, and they would export hides to import shoes. It was a colony in all but name. The United States owned 90% of their mines, 80% of their utilities, 50% of their rail, and 40% of their sugar production, while making up 2/3 of their imports.
By the 1930s, big banks owned 60% of these sugar farms, 80% of the tobacco farms, and 100% of the railroads and shipping facilities.
If you've got a keen ear, you probably noticed that I paraphrased part of a famous speech entitled "History Will Absolve Me," which was written by the child of some wealthy Cuban landowners who became an activist lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro. On July 26, 1953, he and a group of radicals attempted to overthrow the Batista regime. The plan was not a success, and he was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 1955, under immense political pressure, Batista released Castro along with other political prisoners in an attempt to win points with a country that was turning against him. Fidel, his brother Raul, and other Cuban exiles went to Mexico to train in guerrilla tactics and plot to overthrow Batista again. It was there that they would meet an Argentine man who was also a child of wealthy landowners and had become radicalized while traveling through Latin America, witnessing firsthand the devastation caused by United States imperialism. His name was Ernesto Guevara, but the Cubans called him Che on account of how often he used that Argentine word. He joined their group, and a year later, Che, Fidel, Raul, and about 80 other men boarded a ship that was meant to only hold a maximum of 25 people and set sail to overthrow the Batista regime for good this time. As you can imagine, that plan was an absolute failure. They arrived 2 days after their diversion, and Batista's men were already waiting for them. Only about 20 of the 80 men who boarded that ship survived, and they were chased into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, where Batista could have easily sent a contingent of soldiers to finish him off, but to quote Cuban author and journalist Carlos Montaner, Batista does not finish Fidel out of greed. His is a government of thieves. To have a small guerrilla band in the mountains is to his advantage so that he can order special defense expenditures that he can steal. Over the course of the next 2 years, the men of the July 26 movement, which people had begun calling Los Barbudos, the bearded ones on account of them not being able to shave, began winning not only against Batista's armies, but also winning the hearts and minds of the people. New Year's Eve 1958, Batista, seeing the writing on the wall, fled the country with a $300 million fortune he had amassed through his corrupt dealings, as well as allegedly another $700 million of stolen cash and artwork from the country. He attempted to go back to Florida, but was denied entry into the United States and Mexico. Portugal eventually took him in. Now, contrary to what often gets taught, Fidel Castro was not hiding any communist beliefs. He was left-leaning, but he wasn't as radical as Che or his brother Raul. Fidel Castro wasn't a communist, but the United States made him one. That's not me or my opinion, by the way. That's just me paraphrasing something that Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, said at the Vienna summit in 1961. Castro is no communist, but United States policy can make him one, which is what happened.
Yeah, about a year after the agrarian reform was introduced and some American properties, rural properties, the King Ranch and so forth, were nationalized, the Cuban government ordered the foreign refineries, 2 of which were American, to refine Soviet crude oil. I think their first inclination was to do it, but they were encouraged by the U.S. Treasury Department not to. So they refused. They would not refine the Soviet crude. The Cuban government then nationalized those refineries, the oil companies in Cuba. The United States retaliated for that by cutting off the Cuban sugar quota, and Cuba then retaliated for that by nationalizing all U.S. properties in Cuba.
He was very much willing to continue working with United States businesses, and the United States is always willing to work with any dictator, provided they don't break the cardinal rule of capitalism and do something like put the well-being of their people ahead of profits. Leaders like that don't tend to last long, especially in Latin America. And sure enough, the CIA tried to hit him with the classic, find people that want him dead, give them the money, weapons, and training that they need, and then unleash them on their target. But in the case of with Castro in Cuba, the plan didn't work. It was a colossal failure, and it had the effect of endearing him more to the people and pushing them even further to the left. By the way, have you properly guessed who said that quote I started this video with? It was John F. Kennedy from October 1963. He was sort of weighing the options of normalizing relations with the island again, but he was dead less than a month after he gave the interview, so we'll never know how that could have worked out. But while I'm still in the mood for trivia, do you know who called Castro the only white man he ever liked? Let me know in the comments. Alright, YouTube, what's good? First of all, thank y'all so much for watching that video. I hope y'all liked it. If you did, let me know in the comments. Hit the like button. If you didn't like it, hit the dislike button. I don't care. And most importantly, hit the subscribe button. As I'm sure you've noticed, I've kind of shifted away from the linguistics based and African American English type of content that I've been uploading on here regularly. It's not that I'm never going to make any of those videos anymore. I actually have a few ideas for some, but I'm going to do more stuff like this, which is going to allow me to be a little bit more consistent on this platform like I am on Instagram and TikTok. I want to talk about more stuff that's important to me and more stuff that I learned from these random rabbit holes that I fall into. Actually, there's probably going to be another video about Cuba upcoming. Speaking of, one of the biggest resources I used to make that video was the Blowback podcast, specifically season 2 of Blowback, where they talk about Cuba. If you want to learn more on that topic, I'd highly suggest you go to their website, listen to that podcast. They also have all of their sources on their website. If you go to it, I used many of their sources when I was researching the information to upload this video. Anyways, for a long time I kind of just wanted to keep this channel purely linguistics based and only talk about like language stuff here, and that kind of led to me not being able to make videos, and I really had an urge to, you know, put some other stuff out there, but I didn't know how people would react to it and everything, and that's kind of why you haven't seen many uploads from me. But I do want to change that. I do want to be way more consistent here. So yeah, I'm going to do longer form stuff. You're probably going to get maybe 1 or 2 videos a month. I know I said that plenty of times in the past, and who knows if I'll be able to hold myself to that now. But yeah, you're going to get a more large variety of stuff from me in this channel now. So hopefully everybody that followed me originally, if y'all will still want to continue following me, cool. You can support me if you want to on Patreon as well. I got like a $1 tier where if you just want to throw me a little bit of support and that's it. I've got like another tier where you can see some of my stuff early, get some bloopers or get some extended versions of whatever I'm working on there. But yeah, just like please continue watching my stuff, sharing my stuff, letting people know about my stuff. And yeah, hopefully y'all see a lot more from me in the future. All right, ciao.